Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst in a journey back in time. A trip so immersive you might just forget what central heating feels like. Imagine, for a moment, that you've woken up not in your comfy bed, but on a straw-filled pallet in a drafty, smoky hovel. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale food, and something vaguely animal. Outside, a pig grunts contentedly, or perhaps not so contentedly, beneath a window that's less panoramic view and more hole in the wall. You reach to scratch an itch, and suddenly, you're wondering if that's just a regular itch or a new, unwelcome guest making itself at home. Because tonight, we're exploring why you, my dear, delicate modern listener, probably wouldn't last a day in medieval times. It's a reality check wrapped in a historical blanket, and let's just say, your chances of a long and prosperous life would be, well, numerically challenged. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake, not to the gentle beep of an alarm, but to the insistent crowing of a rooster right outside your window, if indeed you have a window beyond a simple, unglazed opening. The smell, as mentioned, is profound. Your nose, accustomed to scented candles and air purifiers, immediately rebels. This isn't just a general old smell. It's a symphony of unwashed bodies, wood smoke clinging to everything, the faint tang of animal waste from the nearby livestock, and a not-so-faint aroma of whatever was cooked last night, probably something stewed, something hearty, and something that's now clinging to every fiber of the straw you're sleeping on. You groggily sit up, noticing the rough texture of your homespun tunic. Forget soft cotton or breathable synthetics. This wool is scratchy, probably full of fleas, and hasn't seen soap in, well, possibly ever. Speaking of soap, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of hygiene in the hut. Personal cleanliness, as we know it, simply didn't exist. Baths were rare, a luxury often associated with illness or a special occasion. When they did happen, they were often communal, and the water wasn't changed often, meaning the last person might have been, shall we say, less than sparkling. Imagine sharing a bath with, 5 or 6 other people, all of whom have been toiling in the fields or living amongst animals. Not exactly a spa day, is it? Instead of a refreshing shower, your morning routine would involve a quick splash of cold water, if any, on your face and hands. Deodorant? A concept as alien as a smartphone. Toothbrushes? Forget about it. Your breath, after a night of whatever medieval fare you consumed, would likely be an olfactory weapon. It's no wonder people stood a respectful distance from each other, though perhaps that was more about avoiding accidental contact with unmentionables. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of strong perfumes and incense in later periods was purely for religious purposes or a desperate attempt to mask the pervasive odors of daily life. I'm leaning towards the latter, personally. And let's not even begin to ponder the state of your hair. Washing it was an event, not a habit. Chances are it would be matted, greasy, and playing host to a thriving ecosystem of head lice. You'd probably develop a talent for vigorous scratching without appearing too uncivilized, a sort of involuntary head massage born of necessity. The idea of clean, flowing locks like you see in those historical dramas? Pure fantasy, unless you were incredibly wealthy and had servants dedicated to such tasks, and even then, their understanding of clean was interpretive. You'd likely be far more concerned with basic survival than with the latest medieval hair care trends, which mostly involved hats and hoods. Even going to the toilet was an adventure. No flush, no privacy, often just a hole in the ground, or, if you were slightly more fortunate, a designated garderobe that emptied directly into a moat or a cesspit. The stench around these areas would be overwhelming, a constant reminder of the lack of proper sanitation. And then there's the delightful reality of shared privies, or simply doing your business wherever seemed most convenient, which often meant right outside your door. It was a world where human and animal waste was just part of the landscape, fertilizing fields and breeding grounds for every imaginable disease. So, you see, within the first hour of your medieval day, you're already facing an onslaught of sensory challenges and a fundamental reevaluation of what constitutes basic human dignity. So, you've survived the morning stench and the existential dread of medieval hygiene. Now your stomach rumbles. What's for breakfast? Forget your avocado toast or artisanal coffee. Your daily sustenance in the Middle Ages was a far more practical and often monotonous affair. If you were lucky, and most people weren't, you might have a thick gruel made of oats or barley, possibly seasoned with a bit of salt, if salt wasn't too precious. This wasn't the kind of oatmeal you spruce up with berries and brown sugar. This was dense, gray, and designed purely for caloric intake. Perhaps a chunk of dark, hard bread, baked from coarse grain, often with bits of husk or even grit mixed in. Chewing it was an exercise in jaw endurance. Meat was a luxury for the vast majority. If you were a peasant, you might get a taste of meat only a few times a year, perhaps after a successful hunt on common land or risky endeavor, as poaching royal or noble game could cost you an arm, a leg, or your head. Most of your protein would come from peas, beans, or perhaps some hard cheese if you had access to dairy. And let's be honest, that cheese would be nothing like the gourmet selections at your local supermarket. It would be rustic, often quite pungent, and likely made with methods that would make a modern food safety inspector faint. Best by dates? That's a hearty chuckle for your medieval self. You ate what you had, when you had it, and you hoped it hadn't gone too far off. Fresh fruits and vegetables were eaten seasonally, and often raw, if they were safe. There was no refrigeration, of course, so preservation was key. That meant a lot of pickling, salting, and drying. Your diet would lack many essential vitamins, leading to a host of deficiency diseases that we rarely see today. Scurvy, anyone? Imagine your gums bleeding and teeth falling out, all because oranges are a distant, exotic dream. A quirky tidbit. During famines, people were sometimes so desperate they would eat tree bark or even dirt, a stark reminder of how close to the edge survival truly was. And water? Your tap water certainly wasn't potable. Most people drank ale or weak beer, even children, not because they were perpetually tipsy, but because the fermentation process made it safer than the often contaminated water sources. Imagine your morning coffee being replaced by a pint of lukewarm, slightly alcoholic brew. It sounds fun in theory, but in practice, it was just a necessity. This wasn't about leisure drinking, it was about avoiding dysentery. Historians still argue whether the perceived constant tipsiness of medieval peasants contributed to a general acceptance of harsh conditions or merely numbed the senses to the daily grind. Either way, you'd be a bit hazy around the edges more often than not. Cooking was done over an open fire, meaning smoke inhalation was a daily reality for medieval cooks, leading to chronic respiratory issues. Your meals would be simple, one-pot affairs, designed for maximum calories and minimal fuss. Imagine a perpetual stew, constantly simmering, with new ingredients added as they became available. It might sound economical, but it also meant that a single bad ingredient could spoil the entire pot, and food poisoning was a common and often fatal occurrence. You'd develop a keen sense of smell, not for discerning fine wines, but for detecting the first whiff of spoilage your life depended on it. So, as you chew on your hard bread, perhaps chasing it with a swig of small beer, you realize that every meal is a calculated risk. Is this food good enough? Will it make me sick? Will it provide enough energy for another day of back-breaking labor? The modern concept of eating for pleasure would be utterly alien to you. Eating was for survival, pure and simple, and often wasn't very pleasant at all. With your bland, risky breakfast grudgingly consumed, you step outside your humble dwelling, and the world immediately reminds you of its inherent hostility. Forget the curated safety of your modern environment. In medieval times, constant threats loomed around every corner, and even the most mundane activities carried a significant risk of injury, illness, or worse. You might glance up at the sky, not to check the weather app, but to gauge if a sudden storm might turn the already treacherous muddy paths into impassable quagmires. The very ground beneath your feet is a hazard. Paths are uneven, often strewn with rocks, ruts, and animal droppings. A simple twisted ankle could mean an infection, a permanent limp, or even death in a world without antibiotics or effective medical care. Imagine traversing these paths in crude, ill-fitting shoes, or even barefoot. The threat of a splinter, a sharp stone, or stepping on something truly unpleasant is a constant companion. And if you're traveling any distance, the danger escalates. The roads are not patrolled by police. They're the domain of bandits and highwaymen, eager to relieve you of your meager possessions, or worse. A solo journey was an act of bravery or desperation, not a relaxing scenic drive. Beyond the immediate physical environment, there's the constant specter of disease. We've touched on hygiene, but the lack of understanding about germs and sanitation meant that epidemics were a regular, devastating occurrence. The Black Death is perhaps the most famous example, wiping out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population in a few short years. But smaller outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, and influenza were a routine part of life. You'd wake up feeling a bit under the weather, and instead of reaching for ibuprofen, you'd be gripped by a cold fear, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. A quirky tidbit: some medieval doctors believed that bad smells, or miasma, caused disease, leading them to carry sweet-smelling herbs or flowers to ward off illness, which, while not effective against germs, at least made the air around them slightly more tolerable. Your daily interactions, too, held a degree of unpredictability. Disputes were often settled with fists, knives, or whatever improvised weapon was at hand. There was no readily available 911. Justice, if it came at all, was slow, brutal, and often biased against the common person. Even a simple argument with a neighbor could escalate into violence, leaving you with injuries that would be easily treatable today, but could be life-altering then. And if you had the misfortune to offend someone of higher social standing, your existence could become a living nightmare with little recourse. Historians still argue whether the perceived higher levels of violence in medieval society were due to a lack of centralized authority or a more inherent cultural acceptance of physical conflict. Either way, you need to keep your wits about you. Even the weather itself was a more formidable adversary. A harsh winter could mean starvation if crops failed or supply lines were cut. A summer drought could ruin harvests, leading to famine. You were utterly at the mercy of natural forces, without the safety nets of modern agriculture, supply chains, or disaster relief. Your very survival hinged on the whims of nature, a concept that feels abstract to us, but was a daily, tangible anxiety for medieval people. You might have a roof over your head, but it offered little protection against the broader environmental and societal dangers that constantly threatened to unravel your precarious existence. Having navigated the myriad dangers of just stepping outside, a new, more insidious threat emerges: illness. In your brief medieval existence, the concept of a doctor, as you know it, is largely absent. Instead, you'd encounter a bewildering array of healers, often operating on principles that would make a modern medical professional gasp, laugh, or perhaps both. Imagine feeling unwell, a fever perhaps, or a persistent cough. Your first recourse wouldn't be a trip to the ER, but maybe a local wise woman or a barber surgeon. Yes, a barber. Because who better to lop off a limb or bleed you into oblivion than the person who just trimmed your beard? It's a delightfully absurd thought, until you realize it was very much a terrifying reality. Medieval medicine was a terrifying blend of folk remedies, astrological observations, and the omnipresent theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that illness arose from an imbalance of these humors, and the cure was to restore balance. This often involved practices like bloodletting, where a vein would be opened to drain away excess blood, or purging, where you'd be given concoctions to induce vomiting or diarrhea. Imagine being already weakened by illness, only to have a barber surgeon come at you with a sharp blade, insisting that draining your lifeblood is the path to recovery. You'd probably opt for a good night's sleep and hope for the best, assuming your sleeping conditions allowed for anything resembling rest. Pain relief, almost non-existent. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or with crude sedatives like opium or mandrake, often in doses that were either ineffective or dangerously high. Think about a toothache, not the kind that's annoying for a day, but one that throbs relentlessly, potentially leading to a fatal infection. Your options would be limited. Endure it, or have the tooth pulled by an unwashed hand, without numbing, using a terrifyingly crude instrument. The screams echoing from a barber surgeon's tent would be a constant, chilling reminder of the fragility of your body. A mainstream historical fact: medieval surgical instruments, while basic, were often designed for blunt force and quick results, reflecting the need to operate swiftly on conscious patients. The understanding of anatomy and physiology was rudimentary at best. Dissections were rare and often forbidden by religious authorities, limiting true empirical knowledge. Instead, theories were passed down through generations, often based on ancient texts rather than direct observation. A quirky tidbit: one popular cure for epilepsy involved drinking a concoction made from the skull of a deceased criminal, because apparently a bad person's bones would sort out your brain issues. Makes perfect sense, right? Historians still argue whether the limited effectiveness of medieval medicine prolonged suffering or if some traditional remedies actually had unforeseen benefits. You'd certainly be hoping for the latter if you found yourself in their care. Childbirth was another terrifying lottery. Without sterile practices or modern obstetric knowledge, both mother and child faced extremely high mortality rates. Many women died from puerperal fever, a common infection after delivery, and many infants didn't survive their first year. You'd know someone or be someone who had lost a loved one to what we now consider easily preventable or treatable conditions. The sheer commonality of death, especially among the young, would shape your entire worldview, making life feel incredibly precious and fleeting. So, while you might complain about waiting times at your modern clinic, at least your doctor isn't recommending a leech application for your headache. So, you've somehow dodged the perils of medieval medicine. Your humors are, theoretically, balanced, and you're back in your abode. But is it truly a refuge? Far from it. Your medieval home, whether a humble peasant's cottage or a slightly grander manor house, was a study in draftiness, smoke, a general discomfort. Forget insulation, double-glazed windows, or even a properly functioning chimney. These homes were designed for basic shelter, not for the kind of cozy retreat you unwind in after a long day. Let's start with the warmth, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. Your primary source of heat would be an open hearth, usually in the center of the room or against one wall. While this provided some warmth, it also filled the entire living space with smoke. Imagine constantly breathing in the acrid tang of wood smoke, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Your lungs, accustomed to clean air, would quickly protest, leading to chronic coughs and respiratory ailments. A quirky tidbit: some medieval houses had a smoke hole in the roof instead of chimney, which meant that when it rained, you had a lovely combination of smoke and dripping water indoors. Quite the ambience, wouldn't you say? Lighting was equally primitive. Windows, if present at all, were often just unglazed openings, covered with shutters in bad weather, plunging the interior into near darkness. If you were lucky, you might have small panes of horn or oiled linen, offering minimal light and even less protection from the elements. Candles were expensive, reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. So most of your life after sunset would be spent by the dim, flickering glow of the hearth fire or in utter darkness. Forget reading a book. Your evening entertainment would likely involve storytelling, mending tools, or simply trying to sleep through the cold. The construction itself was basic. Peasant homes were often built from wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches plastered with a mix of mud, clay, straw, and dung. While surprisingly sturdy, it offered poor insulation against the biting cold of winter or the heat of summer. Roofs were typically thatched, providing habitat for various creatures, both seen and unseen. You might share your living space not just with your family, but also with livestock, pigs, chickens, maybe even a cow, especially during colder months. This added warmth, yes, but also odors, noise, and of course more pests. Historians still argue whether the close proximity to animals in medieval homes contributed to herd immunity against certain diseases or simply facilitated their rapid spread. You'd probably just be hoping that cow didn't step on your foot. Sleeping arrangements were equally Spartan. Beds as we know them were rare. Most people slept on straw pallets on the floor, often sharing them with multiple family members. The straw would need regular changing due to pests and dampness, a chore you'd probably rather avoid after a long day in the fields. Privacy was a non-existent concept. Everyone lived, ate, and slept in one or two main rooms, meaning your life was an open book to your family members, and often your neighbors too. There was no escaping the sounds, smells, and movements of those around you. So, when you pull that blanket up to your chin tonight, be thankful for your solid walls, your silent heating system, and the glorious, smoke-free air you breathe. You've survived the physical indignities of your medieval dwelling, but now, imagine you've had a disagreement. Perhaps a neighbor's pig has rooted up your meager garden, or a petty theft has occurred. How do you seek recourse? Forget calling the police or filing a small claims court case. Welcome to the medieval legal labyrinth, a system often more terrifying than the crime itself, and certainly not designed for your modern notions of due process or equality before the law. Justice in medieval times was often local, arbitrary, and heavily influenced by social standing. If you were a common peasant, your legal options were severely limited. Disputes would often be heard in a local manorial court, presided over by the Lord's steward, or perhaps the Lord himself. These courts weren't about objective truth. They were about maintaining order, enforcing feudal obligations, and, quite frankly, protecting the Lord's interests. Imagine standing before someone who holds absolute power over your life and livelihood, trying to argue your case with no legal representation and no real expectation of fairness. The punishments were also drastically different. For minor offenses, you might face a fine, often a crippling amount that could plunge you deeper into debt or even servitude. For more serious crimes, the consequences were brutal and public. Think stocks and pillories, where you'd be subjected to public humiliation and the jeers and sometimes projectiles of your neighbors. Mutilation, like the loss of a hand or an ear, was a common punishment for theft. And for truly grave offenses, or if you were simply unfortunate enough to incur the wrath of a powerful figure, the gallows awaited. The concept of rehabilitation or correctional facilities was centuries away. Justice was about deterrence through fear and retribution. A mainstream historical fact, trial by ordeal, such as holding hot iron or being thrown into water, was a common method of determining guilt or innocence, based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent. But what if you were accused of a crime you didn't commit? Evidence, as we understand it, was often secondary to confession, which could be extracted under torture. There were no forensic teams, no DNA evidence, and certainly no right to remain silent. If you were unlucky enough to be suspected, your chances of proving your innocence against the word of an accuser, especially one of higher status, were slim to none. A quirky tidbit: sometimes disputes over land or property were settled by trial by combat, where the two parties would fight it out, with the victor presumed to be in the right, sometimes even using champions to fight on their behalf. Imagine your garden dispute ending in a duel to the death. Historians still argue whether the harshness of medieval justice effectively suppressed crime or merely pushed it underground. Regardless, you'd live in constant awareness of its brutal potential. The legal system was not a safety net. It was a precarious tightrope, with terrifying consequences for a misstep. You'd learn very quickly to keep your head down, avoid conflict, and hope that no one with power ever took an interest in you. Because once you entered that legal machine, escaping with your life and your limbs intact was far from guaranteed. You've made it through the morning, survived a meal, dodged disease, and navigated the perilously unhygienic comforts of home, all while trying to avoid the medieval justice system. But one fundamental truth shapes your entire existence, a truth far more rigid than any modern social construct: your social strata. In medieval times, you were born into your fate, and for the vast majority, there was no escaping it. Forget the concept of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or achieving upward mobility. Your parent status determined nearly everything about your life, from the food you ate to the clothes you wore, and even the air you breathed. If you were born a peasant, as most people were, your destiny was inextricably tied to the land and the lord who owned it. You were a serf, not quite a slave, but certainly not free. You couldn't just pack up your meager belongings and move to the next village for a better job. You were bound to the land. Your days, from sunrise to sunset, were dictated by agricultural labor. You tilled the fields, harvested crops, tended livestock, and performed countless other arduous tasks, all while owing a significant portion of your produce and your time to the Lord. Imagine working tirelessly all day, knowing that a large chunk of your output goes directly to someone else, simply because they own the land you stand on. It's a concept that feels alien to our individualistic society, where personal effort is supposed to directly translate into personal gain. Above the peasants were the knights and nobility, a distinct class of warriors and landowners. They live a life of relative luxury, though still far from modern comforts, supported by the labor of the peasants. Their role was to fight, to protect the land, and to administer justice or injustice, depending on your perspective. You might see them riding past on their majestic horses, clad in armor, a stark contrast to your simple woolen tunic. Their lives were still dangerous, filled with warfare and political intrigue, but their daily struggle was of a completely different order. A mainstream historical fact: the feudal system, with its clear hierarchy of lords, vassals, and serfs, was the dominant social and economic structure across much of medieval Europe. Then there was the clergy, encompassing priests, monks, and nuns, who held immense spiritual and often temporal power. Their path was different. While they might come from various social backgrounds, joining the church offered a unique form of mobility, a chance to gain influence and education regardless of your birth. However, even within the church, hierarchies existed, and true power was still concentrated among those from noble families. A quirky tidbit: some medieval monasteries kept elaborate necessariums or latrines, complete with running water systems, far more advanced than anything most common people would ever see, highlighting the stark social divide, even in basic sanitation. Your clothing, your diet, your ability to travel, your access to education, even whom you could marry, all of these were largely predetermined by your birth. There was little concept of individual rights or self-determination. If you were born into poverty, you would almost certainly die in poverty, your children inheriting the same fate. Historians still argue whether the rigidity of medieval social structures provided stability or stifled innovation and individual potential. For you, living in it, it would feel less like a structure and more like an inescapable cage. So, as you contemplate your own choices and opportunities today, remember the millions who lived and died with almost none. So, you're locked into your social strata, your fate largely sealed from birth. But what if the Lord commands you to travel? Or perhaps you're one of the rare merchants, daring to bring goods from one town to another? Forget your sleek cars, comfortable trains, or budget airlines. Medieval travel was an epic undertaking, fraught with dangers and discomforts that would make your longest road trip feel like a leisurely stroll in the park. Your primary mode of transport would be your own 2 feet, or perhaps a sturdy, albeit slow, ox cart if you were transporting goods. Roads were not paved, well-maintained highways. They were often little more than trampled dirt tracks, turning into muddy quagmires in the rain and dusty, rutted paths in the dry season. Imagine trudging for miles on end, wearing uncomfortable, ill-fitting shoes, your feet aching, blistered, and covered in grime. Every step was a negotiation with the terrain, a test of endurance. A mainstream historical fact: The average speed of travel on foot in medieval times was about 20 to 25 miles per day, meaning a journey of just 100 miles could take 4 to 5 days, weather permitting. The concept of a rest stop or motel was, of course, entirely absent. You'd rely on the hospitality of monasteries, if you were fortunate, or more likely, local inns that were often little more than overcrowded, flea-infested hovels. You'd share a common sleeping area with strangers, your possessions under your head for fear of theft. Food would be basic and often overpriced, and the ale, well, already know about the ale. The chances of catching an illness from your fellow travelers, or simply from the unsanitary conditions, were incredibly high. And then there were the dangers. As mentioned before, bandits and highwaymen were a very real threat. A lone traveler, or even a small group, was an easy target for those looking to relieve you of your coin, your goods, or even your life. You'd likely travel armed, if you could afford a weapon and knew how to use it, but even then, numbers and surprise were often on the side of the attackers. Imagine the constant anxiety, every rustle in the bushes, every shadowy figure on the horizon, raising your heartbeat. Navigating was another challenge entirely. No GPS, no road signs, just local knowledge passed down through word of mouth, or perhaps the occasional, often inaccurate hand-drawn map. Getting lost was a genuine possibility, leading to wasted time, exposure to the elements, and increased vulnerability. A quirky tidbit: some medieval travelers would rely on the position of the sun and stars, or even the growth patterns of moss on trees, to find their way, a testament to their deep connection with the natural world and their lack of modern navigational aids. Even crossing a river could be a major ordeal. Bridges were rare and often expensive to cross, or poorly maintained. You might have to rely on a ferryman, whose boat might be leaky and whose motives might be suspect. Or in desperation, you might try to ford the river yourself, risking drowning or losing your meager possessions in the current. Historians still argue whether the challenges of medieval travel fostered greater community reliance or perpetuated isolation between different regions. For you, the experience would be one of unremitting physical discomfort, constant vigilance, and a profound appreciation for every mile you managed to put behind you, assuming you made it all. You've traversed the treacherous roads, faced the threat of bandits, and somehow arrived at your destination, or perhaps simply made it back home. But the concept of free time, as you know, it is largely a myth in medieval life. Your existence would be defined by workaday woes, an endless cycle of demanding, often monotonous labor that consumed the vast majority of your waking hours. Forget a 40-hour work week, weekends, or paid holidays. Your work was dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the pressing need for survival. If you were a peasant, your day began before dawn and ended well after dusk. Your hands would be your primary tools, calloused and rough from constant toil. You would spend countless hours in the fields, plowing with oxen if you were lucky enough to have them, sowing seeds by hand, weeding relentlessly, and harvesting under the blazing sun or in biting cold. This wasn't just physical labor. It was back-breaking, repetitive, and utterly exhausting. Imagine the sheer physical toll this would take on your body, day after day, year after year, with no modern painkillers or ergonomic equipment to ease the strain. Your body would ache in places you didn't even know existed. Beyond the fields, there were other chores. Women, in particular, faced a double burden of agricultural work and domestic duties. This included grinding grain by hand or at the village mill, often owned by the lord, requiring a fee, baking bread, spinning wool into yarn, weaving fabric, mending clothes, preparing meals over an open fire, fetching water from the well or stream. A daily, heavy task, and caring for children and livestock. There was no concept of convenience food or ready-made anything. Everything had to be produced from scratch by hand. A quirky tidbit: during harvest season, children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute, often by gleaning leftover grains from the fields, reinforcing the idea that childhood was not a period of play, but of early entry into labor. Even if you weren't a peasant, life was still demanding. A craftsman, say a blacksmith or a carpenter, would work long hours in their workshop, often from sunup to sundown, perfecting their trade. Apprenticeships were long and arduous, demanding years of dedication. Soldiers and knights trained constantly, endured the harsh realities of warfare, and often spent months on campaign, far from home. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to prayer and manual labor, whether transcribing texts or working in monastic gardens. Everyone had a role, and almost every role involved significant physical effort and time commitment. There was no clear division between work and life as we understand it. Your home was often your workplace or directly adjacent to it. Your family members were your coworkers. Social gatherings often revolved around communal work, like barn raisings or harvest festivals, where the line between labor and leisure blurred. Historians still argue whether the absence of a distinct work-life balance in medieval society fostered a stronger sense of community or simply led to widespread exhaustion and earlier mortality. For you, it would simply be the rhythm of your existence, a relentless demand on your energy, leaving little room for hobbies, personal pursuits, or even much rest beyond what was absolutely necessary to face the next day's grind. The relentless demands of work meant that childhood, as we understand it to die a protected period of play and learning, was a brief and brutal affair in the Middle Ages. You might recall the harsh realities of medieval medicine and how it impacted overall lifespans. This was particularly true for children who faced an onslaught of challenges from the moment they drew their first breath. For you, the modern listener, the thought of a childhood without toys, extensive education, or even basic medical care is almost unfathomable. Infant mortality rates were staggering. A significant percentage of children wouldn't survive their first year, succumbing to illnesses like dysentery, measles, or whooping cough, conditions that are largely preventable or treatable today. Even if they made it past infancy, the dangers didn't lessen much. Malnutrition was common due to limited and often bland diets, weakening immune systems and stunting growth. A child's immune system, constantly battling unfamiliar pathogens, would be under immense strain. Imagine knowing that even bringing a child into the world was a gamble with such high odds against their survival. Once past the tender age of infancy, children were quickly integrated into the family's labor force. As mentioned, even young children were expected to contribute. By the age of 5 or 7, depending on the region and the family's needs, you would be assigned chores. This wasn't just tidying your room. This meant helping in the fields, fetching water, tending to younger siblings, or assisting with household production like spinning wool. Playtime was often intertwined with practical skills. Games might involve mimicking adult tasks, inadvertently preparing them for their future roles. A mainstream historical fact: medieval childhood was often seen as a miniature version of adulthood, with children expected to contribute to the household economy from a very young age. Education, if it happened at all, was primarily practical, hands-on learning within the family unit. Boys would learn farming techniques or a trade from their fathers, while girls would learn household management and domestic skills from their mothers. Formal schooling, as we'll touch on later, was a rarity. There were no designated play dates or structured extracurricular activities. Your days would be a blend of work, basic survival, and perhaps some unsupervised play outdoors, where dangers like stray animals, accidents with tools, or just falling into a ditch were ever present. A quirky tidbit: despite the harsh realities, medieval children still had toys, albeit simple ones, often dolls made from rags, wooden animals, or spinning tops, showing that the universal instinct for play persevered even in such demanding circumstances. Discipline was often harsh by modern standards, reflecting the need to instill obedience and prepare children for a hard life. The concept of a teenager as a distinct developmental stage was largely absent. You transitioned directly from childhood into young adulthood, expected to take on full adult responsibilities by your early teens. Marriage often occurred young, sometimes arranged, further solidifying their entry into the adult world. Historians still argue whether the early entry into labor in medieval times fostered greater resilience or simply led to premature physical and mental exhaustion. Either way, your modern sense of prolonged adolescence would be utterly baffling to your medieval counterpart. Given the harsh realities of childhood and the expectation of early entry into labor, it's probably no surprise that formal education, as you experience it, was an extreme rarity in medieval times. Forget public schooling, compulsory attendance, or a diverse curriculum designed to foster critical thinking. Education's exclusivity meant that knowledge was power, and that power was largely concentrated in the hands of a very select few. For the vast majority of people, your education was entirely practical, absorbed through direct observation and participation in your family's daily life. You learned how to sow seeds by watching your father, how to bake bread by assisting your mother, and how to mend a tool by observing a craftsman. This wasn't a formal process, it was an apprenticeship in survival, passed down from generation to generation. You learned exactly what you needed to know to perform your role in society, and little else. There was no abstract thinking about algebra or the intricacies of literature. Your focus was on the very tangible skills required to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head. If you were male and exceptionally fortunate, or came from a wealthier family, you might have the opportunity for more formal schooling, typically within the church. Monasteries and cathedrals often had schools, primarily for training future clergy. Here, you might learn Latin, the language of scholarship in the church, and perhaps some basic arithmetic, logic, and rhetoric. But even then, the curriculum was heavily focused on theology and religious texts. The goal was to produce literate clerics, not to cultivate a broad, well-rounded intellect. Imagine your entire educational experience being filtered through a deeply religious lens, where every subject ultimately pointed back to God. A mainstream historical fact: the universities that began to emerge in the later Middle Ages, like those in Bologna and Paris, were largely specialized institutions for law, medicine, or theology, accessible only to a tiny, privileged elite. For girls, formal education was even rarer. Most girls, regardless of social standing, were educated at home, focusing on domestic skills, household management, and perhaps basic literacy if their family could afford a tutor or had access to religious texts. Nuns, however, often received a more comprehensive education within convents, learning to read, write, and sometimes even copy manuscripts. A quirky tidbit: while illuminated manuscripts are often associated with monks, some medieval nuns were highly skilled artists and scribes, producing exquisite books within their convents, quietly challenging the era's gender norms regarding literacy. The printing press wouldn't arrive until the late Middle Ages, so books were incredibly expensive and rare, painstakingly copied by hand. This meant that literacy itself was a luxury, accessible only to those with significant wealth or connection to the church. The idea of personal libraries or widespread access to information was centuries away. Your knowledge of the world would be limited to your village, perhaps the nearest town, and the stories passed down orally. Historians still argue whether the limited literacy rates of the Middle Ages contributed to societal stability by preventing the spread of radical ideas, or simply maintained a system of control by limiting access to information. For you, it meant a world far smaller and far less informed than anything you could possibly imagine. You've grown up quickly, learned your trade, and accepted your place in society. But perhaps the most pervasive and undeniable force shaping every single aspect of your medieval existence is the church. Forget a society where religion is a personal choice or just one aspect of life. In the Middle Ages, religious rigors meant that the church permeated everything, from the moment you woke until you closed your eyes, demanding strict adherence and obedience. It was the central pillar of society, wielding immense spiritual, political, and even economic power. Your life revolved around the church's calendar. Sundays were for Mass, a non-negotiable obligation. Holy days, feast days, and saints' days punctuated the year, offering brief respite from labor, but always with a religious focus. You would participate in processions, pilgrimages, and countless rituals designed to affirm your faith and ensure your soul's salvation. Imagine your entire week, month, and year being framed by religious observance, with no real separation between your secular life and your spiritual duties. Every major life event, birth, marriage, death, was marked by church rites. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was often the largest landowner, an educator, a record keeper, and even a lawmaker. Its courts heard cases related to morality, marriage, and heresy, and its judgments carried immense weight. The threat of excommunication, being cast out from the church and denied the sacraments, was a terrifying prospect, effectively ostracizing you from your community and, in the minds of the faithful, condemning your soul to eternal damnation. This was a fear far more potent than any earthly punishment. A mainstream historical fact: the construction of magnificent cathedrals, often taking centuries to complete, was a testament to the church's enormous wealth, power, and the central role of faith in medieval life. Your worldview would be entirely shaped by Christian doctrine. The Bible, as interpreted by the church, provided the answers to all of life's mysteries. Superstition, divine intervention, and the constant battle between good and evil were not abstract concepts, but tangible forces shaping your daily reality. Every misfortune could be interpreted as God's will or a punishment for sin. Every good fortune a blessing. A quirky tidbit: medieval people often believed in the power of holy relics, fragments of saints' bones, or possessions to perform miracles or offer protection, leading to a thriving, sometimes dubious, trade in such items. Imagine wanting a cure for your ailment and being told to touch a dusty old bone. And then there was the ever-present fear of heresy. To question the church's teachings was not merely a philosophical debate. It was a grave crime, punishable by torture and death. The Inquisition, in its various forms, sought out and punished those deemed to be straying from the true faith. You would learn very quickly to conform, to believe what you were told, and to never voice dissenting opinions, even if you harbored them in the quiet corners of your mind. Historians still argue whether the church's immense power provided much-needed social stability during turbulent times or suppressed intellectual freedom and progress. For you, living under its watchful eye, it was simply an omnipresent force that commanded your unwavering obedience. So, you've navigated the overwhelming influence of the church, accepted your place in the social order, and toiled tirelessly in your daily life. But what happens when that fragile order breaks down? What happens when disputes escalate beyond the local manor court? When a lord's ambition clashes with a king's authority, or when external forces threaten the realm? You're plunged into the terrifying reality of warfare's brutality, a visceral, agonizing experience utterly unlike anything you've ever imagined from history books or films. Forget the sanitized, strategic conflicts of modern times. Medieval warfare was up close, personal, and horrifyingly messy. If you were a peasant, you might be conscripted into the local levy, handed a spear or a bow, and told to march. You weren't a trained soldier. You were a farmer, thrown onto a battlefield with little armor and even less experience. Imagine the terror of facing a charging line of knights, heavily armored and mounted on powerful war horses, their lances poised. Your only defense would be your raw courage, your numbers, and perhaps a desperate prayer. A mainstream historical fact: the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, though later in the period, famously demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of massed English longbowmen against heavily armored French knights, highlighting a shift in battlefield tactics. For the knights and professional soldiers, warfare was their life, but it was still incredibly dangerous. Their armor, while impressive, was heavy and hot, offering protection but limiting mobility. Swords, axes, maces, and daggers were the tools of the trade, used in brutal hand-to-hand combat, where every blow was intended to maim or kill. There were no Geneva Conventions, no rules of engagement beyond what a commander chose to enforce. Quarter was often not given, and the wounded were frequently left to die on the field or dispatched by looting camp followers. Imagine the cacophony of battle, the screams of men, the clash of steel, the thud of bodies, the smell of blood and fear. Siege warfare was equally brutal, if not more so. If your town was under siege, you'd face starvation, disease, and the constant threat of bombardment from trebuchets or catapults hurling rocks, burning pitch, or even plague-ridden corpses over your walls. If the city fell, the consequences were dire. A conquered city was often subjected to pillage, rape, and slaughter, regardless of whether you were a combatant or an innocent civilian. A quirky tidbit: during sieges, attacking armies sometimes used mining tactics, digging tunnels under enemy walls and then collapsing them, an unseen threat that could bring down fortifications in an instant. The aftermath of battle was no less grim. The dead lay unburied, attracting scavengers and spreading disease. The wounded, if they survived, faced excruciating pain with no effective medical care, often leading to slow, agonizing deaths from infection. Limbs were amputated with crude saws, without anesthesia, and the chances of survival were minimal. Historians still argue whether the perceived honor and chivalry of medieval warfare were largely an idealized construct or genuinely influenced the conduct of combatants to some degree. Regardless, for anyone caught in its path, it was an experience of unimaginable horror, leaving deep physical and psychological scars. The memory of the carnage would linger, a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for violence, long after the dust had settled. Having witnessed the raw brutality of warfare, or perhaps just heard the chilling tales, you'd likely seek some form of distraction. But your options for leisure and enjoyment were as constrained as every other aspect of your medieval life. Forget streaming services, video games, or even a quiet evening with a good book. Remember, those were incredibly rare. Entertainment's edge in the Middle Ages was often simple, frequently communal, and sometimes surprisingly harsh by modern standards. For the common folk, entertainment revolved around local festivals, religious holidays, and communal gatherings. These might involve feasting, if food was plentiful, drinking ale, singing songs, telling stories, and perhaps some dancing. Imagine a village fair where the highlight is a wrestling match or a crude puppet show. These were moments of collective joy, a much-needed respite from the relentless toil, but they were infrequent and often tied to the agricultural or religious calendar. A mainstream historical fact: traveling entertainers, known as minstrels or jongleur, provided a vital source of amusement, performing songs, juggling acts, and storytelling for audiences ranging from peasants in a village square to nobles in a great hall. Sports and games were also popular, but they often had a rough, physical edge. Village football, for example, was a far cry from the organized sport we know today. It was a chaotic, often violent free-for-all between entire villages, with few rules and plenty of injuries. Archery was a common pastime, honed for its practical applications in hunting and warfare. There were no padded playgrounds or carefully supervised activities. You learned to be tough from an early age, or you got hurt. For the nobility, entertainment was more elaborate, reflecting their wealth and status. Tournaments and justs were popular, offering thrilling spectacles of combat and displays of chivalry. While these were formalized events, they were still incredibly dangerous, often resulting in serious injury or death. Hunting with falcons or hounds was a favored pastime, both for sport and for supplementing the diet. Board games like chess and backgammon were also enjoyed, offering a more intellectual challenge for those with the leisure to pursue them. A quirky tidbit: medieval cock throwing, a gruesome sport where chickens were tied up and pelted with sticks until dead, was a popular Shrove Tuesday pastime, highlighting the era's vastly different sensibilities regarding animal welfare. You'd probably cringe watching it, assuming you could even stomach being there. Storytelling was paramount, as literacy was rare. Tales of saints, heroic knights, and mythical beasts would be passed down orally, keeping traditions alive and providing moral lessons or simple amusement. These weren't just for children. Adults, too, would gather to listen to long narratives, filling the dark, quiet evenings. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of medieval entertainment fostered stronger community bonds or merely reflected a lack of options in a challenging world. For you, it would certainly highlight a stark contrast to the endless choices and sanitized experiences of your modern recreational life. Your fun would be hard-earned, physically demanding, and perhaps a little bit savage. You've endured the stench, the hardship, the danger, and the utterly alien social structures of medieval times. You've seen how every aspect of life, from birth to death, was shaped by forces far beyond your control. But beyond the physical challenges, there's a deeper, more fundamental difference that would make your survival incredibly difficult: your modern mindset. Living then required a completely different psychological framework to simply exist amidst the constant hardships and uncertainties. Your modern mind is accustomed to a world of predictability and control. You expect fresh food in your supermarket, clean water from your tap, and immediate medical attention for even minor ailments. You believe in individual rights, upward mobility, and the power of progress. In medieval times, all of these assumptions would be shattered. You would live in a world where scarcity was the norm, not the exception. A bad harvest meant hunger, not just higher prices. A simple cut could mean death, not a quick trip to the pharmacy. This constant proximity to death and deprivation would fundamentally alter your perspective, making you incredibly resilient, but also perhaps resigned. Your life was bound by feudal obligations, religious dogma, and the dictates of your lord. You couldn't just choose a different career, move to a new city, or question authority without severe consequences. Your self was largely defined by your community and your role within it, not by individual aspirations or desires. Imagine losing that sense of individual agency, of charting your own course. A quirky tidbit: medieval people often viewed time not as a linear progression of minutes and hours, but in a more cyclical, seasonal way tied to agricultural rhythms and religious festivals, a mindset that reflected their lack of precise time-keeping devices and their deep connection to the natural world. Your emotional landscape would also be vastly different. While human emotions are universal, their expression and context would shift. Grief was ever present due to high mortality rates, particularly among children. Joy, when it came, might be found in simple pleasures like a good harvest, a communal feast, or the safe return of a loved one. The constant awareness of spiritual salvation or damnation would infuse every moral choice, creating a profound existential weight that is largely absent from daily modern life. Historians still argue whether the pervasive fear of eternal damnation in medieval society fostered greater piety or led to widespread anxiety and fatalism. You'd certainly feel the pressure to live a good life as defined by the church every single day. Ultimately, your modern brain, hardwired for comfort, choice, and control, would struggle immensely with the medieval reality of discomfort, limited options, and constant vulnerability. You need to shed centuries of ingrained societal norms, technological dependencies, and psychological expectations. The sheer mental fortitude required to accept widespread suffering, disease, and an often brutal, short life would be your biggest challenge. It's not just about surviving the physical conditions. It's about surviving with a mindset utterly unequipped for the stark, unforgiving reality of a world without modern conveniences or the belief in a constantly improving future. You wouldn't last a day because your very perception of what a day entails and what life should be would be fundamentally at odds with your surroundings. Now, as the echoes of the past begin to fade, feel yourself slowly drifting back to the familiar. The rough straw under you gives way to soft sheets. The acrid smell of smoke and unwashed bodies dissipates, replaced by the faint, clean scent of your room. The chill in the air softens, giving way to the gentle warmth of your blankets. The distant sounds of medieval life, the grunting pig, the harsh cries of merchants, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer melt into the quiet hum of your modern world. Let the lessons of resilience and gratitude settle gently into your mind. There's no need to cling to the details, just the soft understanding of how far we've come and how precious the comforts of your present truly are. Allow your thoughts to slow, to grow hazy and indistinct, like mist rising from a field at dawn. Feel your body relax, your breath deepen, as the images of a challenging past recede, making way for the peaceful blankness of sleep. Let the quiet darkness embrace you,